Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with the latest example of outrageous conduct from the left. In this case, from the campaign of an actual candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, designed to prevent or frustrate those whose opinions differ from the left from exercising their political rights. In this case, it came from Joaquin Castro, a member of Congress from San Antonio and the campaign chairman of his twin brother, Democrat candidate Julian Castro. So what did Joaquin Castro do? He tweeted the names and employers of 44 individuals in his district who contributed the maximum amount allowed by law to the Donald Trump campaign. He then stated that by virtue of contributing to the Donald Trump campaign, they were, quote, fueling a campaign of hate that labels Hispanic immigrants as invaders, close quote. The reaction from Republicans was swift and understandably angry. For example, Senator John Cornyn of Texas stated, quote, this win-at-all-cost mentality, publicly targeting opponent supporters and encouraging retaliation is dangerous and not what Texans have a right to expect from their members of Congress, close quote. Multiple other prominent Republicans issued similar condemnations. Joaquin Castro replied that he hadn't doxed anyone because the information he provided in the tweet was public information. But that ignores the fact that he put it in a tweet. Sure, you can go on the internet and search contribution databases and collect the names of individuals who contributed to the Trump campaign to try to find ones in a specific area that contributed the maximum amount. But that is a time-consuming process. Circulating a tweet with the information in it, on the other hand, is custom-made for mass distribution. It's custom-made for making sure that a wide range of people see it, including those who are most angry, some of whom may engage in aggressive or even violent conduct. Think about how agitated people get on Twitter. Think about the podcast episode where I revealed that a Twitter user had tweeted to me that Vice President Mike Pence was equivalent to Joseph Mengele, the murderous Nazi concentration camp doctor and SS officer who tortured and murdered nearly endless numbers of Jews at Auschwitz. I was shocked, and I explained to him how ridiculous that claim was and suggested that he retract it. I actually thought he would, but he didn't. Instead, he reiterated his original contention. Now think about that environment and those extreme and absurd beliefs. Now think about tweeting into that environment a series of individuals you name, along with their employers, and labeling them as fueling a campaign of hate against Hispanics. Now try to wrap your head around the fact that the person who did that is a member of Congress. I suspect Joaquin Castro wanted to instill fear in the hearts of others who might be thinking about contributing to the Trump campaign. Think I'm being too hard on Joaquin Castro? Well, let's look to his own words. He said he wants, quote, people to think twice, close quote, about supporting Trump. He used those words in connection with tweeting out the names and employers of local contributors to Trump. That sounds very much to me like he wants people to feel threatened so that they don't contribute to the Trump campaign. And that's disgraceful. No member of Congress should engage in that kind of conduct. In fact, Congressman Dan Crenshaw from Texas has suggested that Joaquin Castro's conduct might be something that calls for censure. I think it is, but I won't hold my breath for the Democrat leadership of the House to support that sort of disciplinary action. 7 Republican congressmen have called for the House Ethics Committee to investigate Joaquin Castro for his actions. The request was filed on Friday, August 9. We don't have a response to the request yet. A conservative lawyer named Dan Backer has filed a Federal Election Commission complaint alleging that Castro's action was illegal because it encouraged harassment, bullying, and intimidation of Trump campaign donors. Specifically, he alleges the action broke the law because it combined the donors' names with their employers. I'll keep you advised as to how this FEC action proceeds. But, regardless of the outcome of that complaint, what Joaquin Castro did is inexcusable. His actions injected fear for physical safety into the thinking of Americans wanting to engage in a constitutionally protected activity, the act of contributing to a presidential campaign. It's absolutely unacceptable. As I've thought about what Joaquin Castro did, as with so many other things, it didn't occur in a vacuum. When you think about what he did, think about it as part of a larger pattern of conduct. As we've discussed in prior episodes, the Democrats are labeling President Trump as a racist, and the media is parroting that same attack. Joaquin Castro and others, when criticizing President Trump's statements attacking illegal immigration, routinely fail to note that President Trump was not attacking legal immigration. When President Trump uses the word invaders, he's not talking about legal immigrants, he's talking about illegal immigrants. The distinguishing factor isn't the color or race of the immigrants, it's whether they're legal or illegal. He's referring to individuals who enter the country illegally, in violation of the law, as invaders. Is it sensitive language? No. Is it conciliatory language? No. Is it particularly tactful language? Not really. Is it racist language? Absolutely not. When I look at the way those on the left are labeling Trump supporters, I'm stunned. I'm stunned because it looks like they're repeating the mistake of Hillary Clinton calling 50% of Trump's supporters deplorable and irredeemable, but upping the ante by calling 100% of Trump's supporters racist. How can that possibly be a winning strategy? Sure, if American voters, especially minorities, buy into the claims, they could turn out in droves and propel the Democrat to victory. But to do that, they'd have to turn out in such high numbers that they overcome an increasing turnout by angry Trump supporters and those who are on the fence but can't accept the Democrats' tactics. I've said before that Democrats believing that this tactic could work must be the result of the success of President Obama's turnout efforts in the 2012 election. I think Democrats are making a mistake. But my suspicion is that the Democrats that favor this approach may have something more sinister in mind. The labeling of President Trump as a racist, the labeling of his supporters as racists and enablers of hate, the listing of their employers. I think for many it's designed to cause anyone thinking about attending a Trump rally, contributing to the Trump campaign, or otherwise expressing support for Trump to be fearful for their own safety. And they could be right. For example, Antifa, the loose association that deserves to be labeled a domestic terrorist group, could show up at Trump rallies and attack people on their way to the event. Something worse could happen. What about the fact that he revealed their employers? People remember what's happened to some who failed to follow the tenets of political correctness. Early in this podcast, I talked about Brendan Eich, the CEO of Mozilla, who was forced to resign within a matter of days after it was discovered that he had contributed years before to the California ballot initiative stating that a marriage can only be between a man and a woman. What happens if the size of Trump's rallies start to shrink because people are afraid of violence or afraid that the labeling of support for Trump as racist or fueling hate will catch on and they'll be socially ostracized or lose their jobs? In that event, I think the media and the Democrats would say that it's evidence President Trump is losing support, not that his supporters are fearful of violence or an adverse impact on their jobs. Do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't think the rallies are going to shrink. The evidence of the long lines of customers outside the barbecue shops in San Antonio after they were named as major Trump contributors tends to indicate that I'm right. But we'll see. And in the interim, maybe a miracle will happen and the Democrat leadership will crack down on tweeting of Trump contributors' names, on referring to Trump supporters as racist and enablers of hate. I just won't be holding my breath waiting for that miracle to happen. Next topic. Universal basic destruction. Have you been following Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang? I have, at least somewhat. Not as closely as the top contenders, but certainly to the extent of examining his core policy position. The one which has garnered him significant support from young Democrats and put him at or near the top of the Drudge Report online poll results indicating the winner of each of the Democrat debates. Now, I know the Drudge Report results are not indicative of the universe of Democrat voters, but it's at least somewhat indicative of the feelings of young voters. So what is that core policy position of Andrew Yang which has so many young Americans interested in him? It's universal basic income, UBI, the idea that the federal government should pay American citizens a stipend for being American citizens. Yang calls his version the freedom dividend. His proposal is that every American 18 years of age and older receive $1,000 per month. It would not replace Social Security. It would not replace military or other government retirement. It would replace certain welfare programs if the recipients chose to go with UBI rather than the welfare program, which presumably they would if the welfare program was worth less than $1,000 per month. So why does Yang say he's proposing it? He says we need it because of all the jobs which are going to be replaced by automation. He says it provides stability and economic fairness when that occurs. I would bet that the idea of receiving an extra $1,000 a month seems enticing. But who pays for it? You know, you either have to reduce budget expenditures elsewhere, which I have very little faith will ever happen, increase taxes, or print money. If you print money, we should see inflation which offsets the benefit of the program. If we increase taxes, we run the risk of reducing growth. So what is Yang proposing to fund the program? He's proposing a 10% value-added tax. Assuming for the sake of argument that a 10% VAT would in fact result in enough tax revenue to fund a $1,000 a month payment to every American citizen, I still have serious problems with universal basic income, and I've had a number of debates in the last couple of months about the issue. My biggest problem with the idea is where it will lead. One of my most major frustrations over the years with conclusions reached by some in the American public about proposals from politicians is that they fail to take into account the reactions if the proposals take effect. People evaluate the situation that faces them and change when the situation changes. For example, over the last several decades, it's become much more difficult to fire individuals, especially if you're going to do it in large numbers. It takes more time, more planning, more hoops to jump through. Is it any wonder then that employers make wider use of independent consultants and employment agencies? If you change the rules, you may change behavior. But with Yang's proposal, it's not so much the behavior of companies that I'm thinking about, it's the behavior of politicians. If by some miracle Andrew Yang were to win the Democrat nomination and then go on to win the presidency, every politician aspiring to become president would see his UBI plan as the key to his election. And what are they going to do? They're going to bid it up. The next campaign, they'll be going for $1,500 a month, or $2,000 a month, or $3,000 a month. Do I hear $5,000? $5,000 anyone? It won't end. The sky's the limit. Once you have somebody taking office by agreeing to pay people a fixed sum per month, there will be no end in sight, at least as to the amount proposed to be paid. As to our capitalist economy, as to our freedoms, that's another story. We can't afford the programs we have now. There's no way we can afford to start adding $1,000 a month, and eventually much more on top of that for every single American adult. Moreover, look at what happened in the first Democratic debate. when every single candidate raised their hand when asked if they supported free government health care for illegal immigrants. Now think about where Democrats would take UBI in the future. That's right. They'd propose extending it to American residents, immigrants, even illegal immigrants, rather than limiting it to American citizens as Andrew Yang has proposed. They do it in hopes of garnering the votes of those immigrants when they become American citizens, or of the relatives with whom they're staying who are already American citizens. And the number of immigrants crossing the border illegally would skyrocket, far beyond anything anyone has seen to date. And as the dollar amount per month would keep climbing and the budget expenditures skyrocketing, it would all come crashing down. Millions and millions of Americans would see a government handout as the way to make it in the country. And when they all started voting based on that, the economy would crash, because the numbers of citizens actually working most productively wouldn't be enough to support their fellow Americans who chose to simply rely on the government UBI. So what would happen? We'll say goodbye to everything we as Americans and our ancestors built. Who knows what kind of oppressive system and regime might arise out of that level of collapse? I don't. But I do know enough about the sausage-making process to know that a proposal never ends up exactly as originally envisioned, and people and companies change their behaviors as the situation changes. And if the situational change is the adoption of universal basic income, those changes among people and businesses won't be good. Some of you may be thinking, well, he addressed universal basic income as a bad idea, but he never addressed the problems which will be caused by automation, the massive number of jobs which will be lost. If UBI isn't the answer, what is? Well, the answer is that we need to recognize that we control the technology. The technology doesn't control us. Just because something is going to be invented doesn't mean that it has to be given the unregulated, unfettered right to expand within our society. If it's so destabilizing and so destructive of levels of employment that we need to consider UBI as an offset, then that technology, automation, is certainly something for which regulation, even very restrictive regulation slowing the speed with which it expands, or prohibiting its expansion into certain areas temporarily, or conceivably even permanently, is something that needs to be on the table. Let me give you an example. We might adopt a regulation in the future that says that self-driving trucks can't be deployed for a certain number of years. We might even adopt a schedule which allows self-driving trucks only of a certain relatively small size, so that the big over-the-road semis don't become self-driving for a number of years, such as 10, 20, or maybe even 30 years, for example. I'm not a big fan of regulation, but when technology is so destabilizing that we consider something as radical as UBI to offset it, restrictive regulations start to look a lot better to me. Next topic. The politics of tragedy. Last week was not a pleasant one for anyone who enjoys watching or reading the news. The mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton were horrific, and I wish I could say that the fact that the El Paso shootings were almost immediately politicized was a shock. It wasn't. The El Paso shooter is the personification of evil. His racist philosophy, as evidenced by the contents of the manifesto which he appears to have written, although there's some indication that he wasn't the one who actually posted it, is sick, twisted, and despicable. The fact that so many Democratic politicians and members of the news media have blamed President Trump for the shooting is despicable as well. It's reached the point that Democrat politicians are being asked whether President Trump is a white supremacist. It's a ridiculous question. Incidentally, as I'm sure you're aware, there's no doubt that the El Paso shooter is a racist. He's absolutely opposed to the mixing of the races, an undoubtedly racist view. He actually contends that the U.S. must be divided up into multiple territories with one race per territory to avoid mixing. In that respect, as ridiculous and offensive as his proposal is, he's probably more appropriately labeled an ethno-nationalist rather than a white nationalist, because he isn't insisting that America be entirely white, but rather that the races be separated within America. It's a sick philosophy either way, and incidentally, a propensity to believe that the races should be separate is the opposite of a conservative view of race. Conservatives tend to believe we are all in this together. It's progressives, leftists, that tend to obsess upon race, and most recently encourage things like separate graduations or dormitories for African Americans and other groups identified as oppressed. But what exposes the extent to which the El Paso tragedy is being used for political purposes is the fact that the news media isn't reporting the non-racial aspects of this killer's views expressed in his manifesto. He's apparently worried about oil drilling, pollution, sustainability, and other environmental issues, and the influence of big corporations on the government. He's also apparently a supporter of universal basic income. I don't want to give this guy more attention. That's why I haven't referenced his name. I had to read the manifesto so that I could accurately report on this story, but I have limited quoting from it. I also gathered information from an article on the WashingtonExaminer.com on August 7 by Byron York entitled, "Has anyone actually read the El Paso Manifesto?" Well, I have. As I said, it's sick, it's twisted, and it's not something that espouses conservative or Republican views. And even though there are parts of it which actually reference liberal, leftist, progressive, or Democrat views, it is in no way the result of liberal, leftist, progressive, or Democrat views. Instead, the blame here rests squarely on one evil, twisted, and sick individual whose name I will not utter. Hopefully you'll utter my name, or at least type it in the form of @FranklinRye when seeking out my Twitter page. I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. And here's a heads up regarding a future appearance. On August 24, for the full hour from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern, I'll be on IPR Radio, the intersection of politics and real estate, with host Kelvin Moxley. With me on the show, there'll probably be more of a focus on politics than real estate. You can listen to the show at a number of sites. It originates out of Knoxville, Tennessee. You can hear it there locally at 92.3 FM or 760 AM. You can pull it up on Facebook at IPR Radio, or you can go to talkradio923.com. Please remember to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and remember to like the Political Spirits podcast on Facebook. And follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.